وأصلي وأسلم على رسول الله محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.
The Shaykh Hafidahullah concluded this session with us by reading a final paragraph. وَالْفَرْض, that which is obligatory. That which is obligatory and must be performed regarding al-wudu is that these actions that we have mentioned to you must be done at least once. Each of them must be done at least once. And they are to be done in the order that Allah mentions in al-Quran. In the verse which is found in Surah Al-Ma'idah, which is chapter 5, verse number 6, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala establishes, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, O ye who have faith, when you stand up and you are preparing for the prayer, فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ, begin by washing your faces, and then your arms or your hands, and pass water over your head, and wash your feet to the wash your feet and include along with them the ankles. So this tartib, this order of performing and this syntax of performing the wudu is something that must be adhered to. Although the Shaykh mentions, Shaykh Muhammad Nasr al-Albani has shown that there are a few ahadith where the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam changed the order of wudu in one or two instances. But the Shaykh mentioned that he, in viewing the criteria that was used and the research of the Shaykh feels that there needs to be some more follow-up on the tahseen of the ahadith that were mentioned. And this is something that the Shaykh mentions only because of the sacredness and of the trust of teaching and seeking knowledge. He then continued by saying, so this is also from the requirements that you perform the wudu in the manner that was described to you, in that form and without changing or putting one in front of the other and confusing the order. The second thing that the Shaykh mentions to us in the chapter or in the paragraph, that there should not be an extended period of time between washing each of the two body parts. Each of the body parts. So therefore, the Shaykh mentions, if for example, someone began making wudu in this building, and all of a sudden the water main broke, and he said, let me go to the next apartment or the next building, and the time period took 1 or 2 minutes, and he was not preoccupied with other things, and he went and he immediately continued his wudu, that is acceptable and valid. But if we did not have this time requirement as being a constraint and something that is necessary, you would have found people who would begin wudu at 7 a.m. and they would wash their hands and make istinshaq at 7, and then they would go to work or something, and at 9 a.m. when they have some time, they'd wash their face, and then a little bit later they do an arm, a little bit later another arm, and by the time Salatul Dhuhr comes, during the span of the day, they would have made their wudu. This is something obviously that is unacceptable for the time requirement. It's something that is integral. Why? The Shaykh gives us a statement. The Shaykh Hafidahullah gives us a statement. Wudu is valid when a part is built upon another part, meaning the hands, then washing the mouth and the nose, then the face, then the arms, wiping the head, then the feet with the ankles. So it's built one part on top of a part. If this building process is something that is undermined for whatever reason, therefore it is something that undermines the wudu and its validity. And then وَكَذَلِكَ, and as such, all of the things, the Shaykh mentions, all of the things that are prerequisites of the wudu are also to be seen as integral to the validity of the wudu, meaning specifically intention and so forth. And this is where the Shaykh Hafidahullah concluded his session with us. Jazahullahu anna wa ankum khayra. And we will take some of your questions. There's other questions from the sisters? So they're not left out. He answered this one already, so I'm just going to translate it.
Sisters, if you could have your questions ready, someone's coming across now.
المترجم عن ايش؟ نعم وإن كان الوضوء صحيحا أي one of the questions, the question mentions that the Sheikh mentioned when we are making wudu, we should not wash one thing one time and another thing 2 times and a third thing 3 times. The Shaykh is mentioning that if this is done, although it should not be done, this is something that is not to be done, if one does perform this deed, in the end, his wudu would still be deemed valid. His wudu is deemed valid, but it's not something that a person should intend to do in the very onset. So therefore, the action of doing this is unacceptable. But if a person had done it maybe out of forgetfulness or something of this nature, the wudu would still be deemed substantiated and acceptable. Now,
I'm going to take some questions from the floor to speed up the process, and I'm going to take liberties with you because I've got a question. I've had to be able to ask many, inshallah. On this point that the Sheikh's saying, in al-Arkan of Maqdisi, there's a hadith in, I think it's narrated by one of the Abdullah ibn Zayd, I'm not sure, can't be sure, where he described the process of wudu to those he was narrating to, but he did not, and he described the number of times he was washing the limbs, but he did not do it. He stopped when washing the arms and the feet. Now some have derived from that because there was not a specific number wasn't mentioned on the arms and the feet, that you can alternate the washing, yani the face 3 times, the arms, and that's in there. I remember going through that in al-Arkan.
So what's the question?
The question is that can he elaborate on that particular hadith? Because some take that non-mentioning of the arms and the feet. Now, it's a mutafaq umdat al-Arkan.
Hadith Abdullah ibn Ziyad أو زيد.
نعم.
هذا؟
لا
الوضوء. أيوة إيش السؤال؟
نعم.
يذكر أن الحديث أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لما بلغ for the arms سكت الراوي عن عدد غسل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم.
يرجع إلى الأصل.
نعم.
يرجع إلى الأصل أن النبي عليه السلام كان وضوءه على نسق واحد، إما مرة وإما مرتين وإما ثلاثة. فهذا السكوت لا يجوز أن يبنى على المخالفة للأصل. نعم.
The Shaykh Hafidahullah mentions if the hadith is as is stated that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he came and he washed his arms, that the Rawi, the one who was narrating the hadith, he remained silent as to the number of times he washed his arm or his feet. The Shaykh is mentioning that the asl is what we return to. The foundation of the matter, what is the essence of the matter, is that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, all that is reported in the complete chain regarding his wudu is that he would wash either once or twice or 3 times, and he would not mix and match those things together. No.
Assalamu alaikum.
No, alaikum assalam.
In washing over the head, wetting the hair, does it necessitate that the scalp gets wet? And if it is the case, what happens for those people who got a lot of hair? Some brothers got lot of hair. And in the case of some brothers who are not Salafin, but who leave their hair locked or plaited, where the water cannot reach the scalp, or in the case for the sisters who put on extensions, and what happens?
طيب بالنسبة للمسح على الرأس يا شيخ، يوجد أناس شعرهم كثير، هل يجب أن الماء ينزل إلى منابت الشعر في المسح بالنسبة للأخوات أو الرجال؟
لا يجب المسح على ظاهر الشعر فقط.
The Shaykh answered the question simply that the masah, that the only thing that should feel, or that the only thing that is necessary for the water to come in contact with is the top part of the hair. The water does not have to touch the scalp and does not have to go all the way down. Now.
السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام.
الشيخ ذكرت أن الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم سئل عن الصلاة في مرض الإبل فقلت أن أجازها. وهنا في صفحة رقم 24 يقول أن من شروط الصلاة إنها لا تصح في محل نجس ومن ضمن ذلك أن لا تصح في أعطان الإبل.
إذا ورد على لسان ذكر مرابض الإبل فهذا خطأ، إنما هو مرابض الغنم. الرسول عندما سئل عن مرابض الإبل قال لا، وجاء تعليل ذلك في حديث آخر بأنها خلقت من شياطين، لأنها خلقت من شياطين وأي أصل خلقتها، والنص فيه النهي. فإذا ورد على لسان ذلك فأستغفر الله عنه. نعم.
The question that was being asked, and the English brothers may not be able to follow along for one reason, is because I didn't translate the wording of the Shaykh when he mentioned it. The Shaykh Hafidahullah, in the course of his discussion, he mentioned that the Rasul ﷺ permitted us to pray in the places where camels in where we put the camels in stables. In fact, I know that the Shaykh does not view this because he knows, as he mentioned to us, the hadith of the Rasul ﷺ, that the Rasul ﷺ forbade us from praying in the stables where the camels reside. And in another narration, the Rasul ﷺ said, it is because they are created from the shayateen, from the devils. But the Shaykh Hafidahullah mentions that the Rasul ﷺ did permit us to pray in the stables or in the encampments where ghanam, where sheep congregate. And this was what he meant to say, Hafidahullah. But this was something that was not mentioned. I did not mention the camel statement in the translation itself. Now.
Barakallahu Fiqh, Sheikh. There's a question in Ahmed when there's an hadith when the Prophet said, whosoever amongst my nation wear golds and die while still wearing this gold will be forbidden. And then yesterday you mentioned the hadith concerning it's allowed for a woman to wear the gold. So if it's permissible for the sister to wear gold, how do we understand what sort of, is there any restriction in the gold? Like example, like a gold chain. Some people say the chain should not be closed, supposed to be open. So if it's permissible for the woman, what's the restriction? How do we understand these two hadith? Jazakallah khair.
So in a nutshell, what he's saying is that with the woman we know that there's gold, that there's evidence that says gold can be worn. Is there a restriction on wearing that gold? Does it have to be
for prayer or
no? Just generally, could it be circular? Because we know about the ring of gold and the fire. There's a narration that's what he's basically asking.
بالنسبة للمرأة هل في قدر معين للبس الذهب؟ هل في يعني ولا هي تلبس كما شاءت؟
تلبس كما تشاء مع الأخذ بالاعتبار بخلاف الفقهاء في مسألة الذهب المحلق. أما ما كان جائزا لها فهو جائز، والكثرة والقلة أمران يعودان إلى النفقة والمال والغنى والذي يوفق الله إليه بعض الناس، وذلك طبعا بشرط الزكاة وأداء حقه الذي افترضه الله على صاحبه. نعم.
The Shaykh Hafidahullah notes that whatever a person deems as a sufficient amount of gold for herself, that is something that is valid, although we note that some of the fuqaha have differed into the types of gold and things of this nature. But the Shaykh says, on a whole, the amount of gold is not the criteria. It is relative and applicable to the financial and social standing of the individual sister. So if the sister is capable to have and purchase gold without going to extremes, putting inconvenience on herself and those who are purchasing it for her or for herself, this is something that she may wear as much as she wishes and she may have as much as she wishes, as long as the zakah is given promptly for the amount of gold that she has and maintains. No.
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.
I've got a question and maybe a request as well. The question is about the wudu. I was taught by one of my teachers that
Uthman bin Affan radiallahu anhu was seen one day performing the wudu 3 times on one hand and 2 times on the other hand. What does he say about it? And my request
Can we take that one first? هل يوجد حديث عن عثمان بن عفان أنه لما توضأ غسل يده ثلاثا ورجليه مرتين فقط؟
لا.
The Shaykh has no knowledge of this, of that hadith that you are regarding Uthman ibn Affan. The hand 3 and the foot twice, right? Is that what you were mentioning? Naam.
One hand 3 times and the other hand twice.
يد 3 مرات. نعم. The same answer.
حديث عثمان في الوضوء وردت له روايات كثيرة، لكن الصحيح منها هو أنه 3 إلا الرأس فمرة واحدة، وورد تثليث الرأس في بعض الروايات الأخرى ويحسنها بعض العلم. أما مرة ومرتين و3 بهذا التنقل فلا أعلم ذلك.
The Sheikh mentions the authentically reported hadith of Uthman, and that's the hadith we were actually discussing indirectly, is that the Uthman taught that the Rasul ﷺ would make the wudu 3 times for each of the limbs except the head, which he wiped once. He did 1 movement. And there are other narrations which some of the scholars have deemed hasan, acceptable and good narrations, where it is mentioned Uthman did the head 3 times as well. Other than that, this is the hadith, this is the foundation that is accepted as being the statement of Uthman ibn Affan, and therefore related from the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
And Jazakallah khair. My request is, can the Sheikh spare some time before the end of the course and give us a brief biography of the Sheikh al-Albani
rahimahullah إن شاء الله. هو يعني يطلب لو عندكم الإمكان قبل انتهاء الدورة أن تتكلموا قليلا عن الشيخ الألباني وحياته.
نرجو ذلك، لكن عندي شيء آخر الآن أنا أقدمه، والأخ يترجم، كتبت 20 بيتا من الشعر وهو يترجم، فأحببت أن أقرأه عليكم.
نعم.
وهي متعلقة بوفاة الشيخ مقبل بدون ترجمة، لكن المشكلة الإخوة عاد.
نعم. The Sheikh mentioned that while I was translating, he wrote 20 verses of poetry discussing a Sheikh Muqbil bin Hadi al-Wadi'i. Obviously, I cannot translate this for you. So the Sheikh
ممكن ترجمة فيما بعد.
حرفيا نعم. I will do my best later إن شاء الله.
فأقول قلت فيها: الحمد لله على الأحزان وكذاك أفراح بكل زمان. هذه الشيوخ توفيت أنفاسها كالباز ثم الصالح الألباني، وقبيل أيام قليل عدها مات ابن هادي العالم الرباني. إن البيوت لها أصول 4 فبنقضها ذي هدة الأركان. الشيخ مقبل عالم ومحدث هو درة في بلدة الإيمان. يمن سعيد بفضله وبعلمه في نصرة للحق والإحسان. أما ذو الأحزاب كل غاضب من نقضه للشر والهذيان، من بدعة أو سوءة أو خالف من مثل كشف خبايا ذي الإخوان. صار الحديث بعلمه ورواته نورا يسدد شبهة الشبان. ذا شعبة ذا مسلم ذا مالك في مثل تخريج وعزو ثاني. للضبط والتحقيق علم شامل رحزت إليه جحافل الركبان. من مثل دماج وصعدة قبلها لا خوف من جبل ولا وديان. صبرا على العلم الذي هو سنة أحيا به ربي قلوب عواني. أمل بصحب الشيخ غير مشتت حرصا على جمع بغير تواني. لا تفتحوا إخواننا شرا بكم بالسوء خلف مقالة الشيطان. فالصبر ثم الصبر ثم نصيحة تحيي القلوب بغير اسم الجاني. يا شيخ يحيى والوصابي بعده وكذا أبو حسن هم إخواني. لا فرق بين شمالهم أو غربهم كل الجهات فسنة العدنان. إن التفرق شره متطاير فالحرص ثم الحق هم نوران. بل واجب بعد الشيوخ توحد وتوحد فيه قوى البنيان. هذا الوفاء الحق نحو شيوخنا لا أن نفرق جمعنا مذآن. صلى الله على نبينا محمد. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد، فهذا هو الدرس الخامس من دروسنا في شرح كتاب منهج السالكين وتوضيح الفقه في الدين الشيخ العلامة عبد الرحمن بن ناصر السعدي رحمه الله تعالى. ولا يزال المؤلف رحمه الله يتكلم في الطهارة وأحكامها، وبعد أن ذكر الوضوء وصفته قال: فإن كان عليه، أي على المتوضئ، يلبس المتوضئ، فإن كان عليه خفان ونحوهما كالنعل والجورب. أما الصندل وما يشبهه مما لا يكون منه تغطية لجل القدم فلا يجوز المسح عليه. ولا يقال بأن الجورب والنعل يغطيان الكعب، بينما لا يقال بأن الجورب والخف يغطيان الكعب والنعل لا يغطيه. نقول قد وردت السنة في هذا كله. أما الصندل وما أشبهه فأولا لم ترد السنة به، والأمر الثاني أنه لا يغطي جل القدم ولو من أسفل الكعب. قال: فإن كان عليه خفان ونحوهما مسح عليهما إن شاء. قوله مسح عليهما إن شاء، المسح يكون على ظاهر القدم الأعلى ولا يكون على أسفله. وهنالك أثر عن علي بن أبي طالب الخليفة الراشد رضي الله عنه أنه قال: لو كان الدين بالرأي لكان المسح على باطن الخف أولى من المسح على ظاهره، وإنما الدين استسلام واتباع. وأما قوله إن شاء فإشارة إلى أن المسح على الخفين ليس على الوجوب. من شاء أن يمسح له أن يمسح، لكن لا نقول يجب عليه أن يمسح. وهنا إشكال يطرح أو يرد على بعض الأذهان، وهو: هل للمسح على الخفين سبب يجيزه، بحيث إذا فقد هذا السبب لم يجوز المسح، كما يقول بعض الناس المسح على الخفين فقط في أيام الشتاء، أو كما يقولون المسح على الخفين فقط في أيام الحرب، أو المسح على الخفين فقط في ساعة الشغل الكثير. كل هذا لا دليل عليه، إنما هو رخصة دائمة ومستمرة في الصيف وفي الشتاء، في الحرب، في السلم، في الشغل، في الفراغ. نعم. قال يوما وليلة للمقيم وثلاثة أيام بلياليهن للمسافر. يوم وليلة أي مقدار يوم وليلة. وبعض الناس يقول 5 صلوات فقط، وهذا خطأ. فقد يصلي 7 صلوات أو 8 صلوات. أما التقييد ب5 صلوات فقط فهذا غير صحيح. وهنا سؤال أو مسألة: متى يبتدئ توقيت المسح على الخفين؟ متى يبتدئ توقيت المسح على الخفين؟ بعضهم يقول من عند نقض الوضوء، وبعضهم يقول من وقت لبس الخف، وهذا كله خطأ. والصواب أن التوقيت يبتدئ عند أول مسحة. فمثلا إنسان صلى الفجر بالوضوء الكامل، وقبيل الظهر بساعة نقض وضوءه فتوضأ ولبس الجورب أو الخف، ثم لم يمسح عليه للصلاة الثانية بعد نقض للوضوء جديد إلا عند المغرب. إذا جاء نقض الوضوء في وقت، ولبس الجورب في وقت، والمسح عليه في وقت. أي من هذه المواقيت هو الذي يضبط به توقيت المسح؟ توقيت المسح. لذلك الرسول عليه الصلاة والسلام قال يمسح المقيم يوم وليلة. إذا جاء التوقيت بالمسح، فعند أول مسحة يكون بدء التوقيت. قال وثلاثة أيام بلياليهن للمسافر، وهذا الذي دلت عليه معظم الأحاديث. ولكن بعض الأحاديث عن عمر رضي الله عنه جاءت لتبين جواز المسح على الخفين للمسافر 7 أيام بلياليه. وعندما سئل عمر رضي الله عنه عن ذلك قال سنة نبيكم صلى الله عليه وسلم. وهذا الحديث بما فيه من فقه هو اختيار شيخ الإسلام ابن تيمية، وكذلك هو اختيار شيخنا أبي عبد الرحمن محمد ناصر الدين الألباني رحم الله الجميع. قال بشرط أن يلبسهما على طهارة، أي من شروط المسح أن يلبسهما على طهارة. نعم، قال إني أدخلتهما طاهرتين، أما أن يلبسهما وهو منتقد فلا. قال ولا يمسحهما إلا في الحدث الأصغر، يعني إذا انتقض وضوءه بجنابة فإن الجنابة تنقض المسح على الخفين فضلا عما هو أكبر من ذلك. أما في الحدث الأصغر من بول أو غائط ونحوه فهذا الذي يجوز عند حصوله الوضوء فالمسح على الخفين فيه. قال عن أنس مرفوعا إذا توضأ أحدكم ولبس خفيه فليمسح عليهما وليصلي فيهما ولا يخلعهما إن شاء إلا من جنابه. رواه الحاكم وصححه. إذن الجنابة شيء من نواقض المسح، لأنه من نواقض الطهارة الصغرى والكبرى والعظمى. نعم.
The Shaykh Hafidahullah began by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and sending the salah and the salam to Nabi Muhammadin sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He continued by reciting Khutbatul Hajah that we have all become accustomed to and stated, Amma ba'd. This is our 5th session with you discussing the book Manhaj al-Salikin wa Tawdih al-Fiqh fi al-Din, written by al-Allama Abdul Rahman bin Nasr al-Sa'di rahimahullah. Today we begin by reciting from the Matn. The Shaykh Hafidahullah began by reading, if a person was wearing a khuf, meaning a leather pair of socks, or that which is similar to it, meaning that which performs the same purpose as it. The Shaykh Hafidahullah paused by saying, things that are similar to the khuf are socks, and things that fulfill the same purpose. The Shaykh continued then by saying, we do not establish sandals as having the same, as being what is similar to a khuf. They are two separate issues. And we do not make this distinction because we feel that the sandals do not cover the ankle while the khuf and the sock cover the ankle. That is a different issue. But the Shaykh says, because there are different narrations for each of these separate things. The Shaykh Hafidahullah then continued by saying and reading, and wiping over them is permitted if one is so inclined. Insha, if one wishes, one is allowed, one is permitted to wipe over his khuf or that which is similar to it. The Shaykh Hafidahullah paused and said, this word insha, if he so wills or if he so inclines, denotes that wiping over the khuf is not a compulsory or a wajib act. It is something that is at the discretion of each individual. If one wishes to make the masah, he may do so. If not, he may remove his khuf or his sock or that which is similar to them and then perform a full wudu. Then the Shaykh mentioned to us the statement of Imam Ali radiallahu anhu wa ardah. This great Sahabi teaches us a lesson in faith and in our adherence to a Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam sunnah by saying, if our deen was substantiated or was taken by mere logic or opinion, it would have been that we wipe at the top of the foot when we wipe over the khuf, we would wipe at the bottom of the foot or the bottom of the khuf instead of the top. If our deen was to be substantiated or measured by opinion or by what would seem logical, it would be that we would wipe the bottom of the foot, the bottom of the khuf, instead of the top of the khuf. Because the bottom is that which is in contact with the ground, while the top usually is cleaner than the bottom of the foot. Then the Shaykh Hafidahullah continued by saying that as we have established that the masah is not something that is compulsory, it is something that is at the discretion of each individual. And that the person who is residing in his city and in his own lands is not in a state of travel, he is permitted to perform the masah, wiping over the khuf or that which is similar to the khuf, for a period of a full day and a full night. لِلْمُقِيمِ, for the one who resides in his homeland. Here the Shaykh paused again and said, here is an issue where we must ask and we must state, is there a sabab, is there a cause or a reason that deems the validity of the masah of the khuf? Is there a trigger or something that allows us to make the masah of the khuf? Is there a reason or a cause? Some people have been accustomed to saying, you only make masah in the winter time, or during the times of war, because you are in need during the battle, you don't have time to wash your feet, you can make masah. Others, they say, if you are in a state of you are excessively busy or preoccupied with other things, you don't have time to take your shoes off and so forth, then you can make masah. They put these as precursors or as prerequisites to the validity of beginning to establish the masah on the khuf. The Shaykh Hafidahullah says all of this is null and void. We do not accept any of these so-called reasons. Rather, al-mas'a al-khuf, it is a rukhsa, a concession. Something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam give us as a gift. It is a concession for those who will to do it, they may do so. Those who do not wish to, they do not have to. It is a concession that is free of these conditions. It is something that if a person, it is at his own discretion, if he fulfills the prerequisites of the masah on the khuf, he is permitted to do so. Then the Shaykh Hafidahullah continued by saying, this measure, this taqdeer, this measure of day, of one full day and one full night, is a relative term that does not mean, as what others have implied, that it means you're allowed to pray only 5 compulsory prayers. This is an invalid statement. Rather, it is the complete time period, the time period of one full day and one full night. That is the period of time that you have the ability to perform the masah on the khuf with valid and due cause. And here the Shaykh Hafidahullah went in detail explaining this to us. He says there's a question, or rather there's an issue that we should seek to ponder over and discuss so that we could get the full benefit. The Shaykh Hafidahullah says, when do you begin counting that one day and one night time span? When do you begin counting? Is it, as some people say, from the moment you break your wudu, that is the moment you begin counting? Or is it when you make the wudu, that is before putting your shoes on or putting your khuffah on or your socks on? Do you understand the two? The first point, is it when you break the wudu that you've made your full wudu and then you put your khuffah on? Is the time period begun when you break that essential first wudu? Or, that's one opinion. Or is it when you actually made that first wudu and then put the khuffah on? Or is it from the first time you perform the masah? The first time that you begin to perform the masah. The correct answer is the third point, is that the time when you first begin to make the masah, that first point where you make the masah, that is the moment you begin counting the day and the night time span, that time period. The Shaykh gives you an example. He says if someone wakes up for Fajr and he makes his full wudu, he then continues through his day and prays Salatul Dhuhr. And then before Salatul Dhuhr, he needs to make wudu. He has not yet put on the khuf. A person wakes up for Fajr, makes wudu, prays the Fajr prayer, he carries on with his day. Before Salatul Dhuhr, he makes on a new wudu. And then he puts on his khuf and prays the Salatul Dhuhr. From that moment, his masah period has not yet begun. Then before Salatul Maghrib, he breaks his wudu and makes a new wudu to pray Maghrib. From that moment, the start period is when, right before the Maghrib prayer, right before the wudu of the Maghrib prayer, the wudu that included the masah, that is the period where you begin counting the day. So that person would then have the full day and night, meaning you would have the masah validity, the ability, this concession to make masah, until the next moment, the next day, up to that time. Is that clear for the brothers and the sisters? بالنسبة للمثل قلت هو قبل المغرب بيمسح. هل المغرب في اليوم اللي بعده
إذا توضأ قبل المغرب يعني نعم. خلال مدة اليوم والليلة
نعم. فهو قبل المغرب لازم يخلع الخف.
أيوه.
نعم. So the Shaykh answers.
مش لازم يخلع الخف. طيب. إذا انتقض وضوءه نعم. لا يجوز له أن يمسح من جديد. لكن لو أن وضوءه استمر إلى العشاء نعم. إلى التجاوز لهذا الوقت ولو ب3-4 صلوات نعم. لا إشكال نعم. أن المهم أنه يمسح خلال مدة 24 ساعة نعم. خلال مدة اليوم والليلة هذا نعم.
The Shaykh Hafidahullah answers, as one of the brothers asks, does that mean as soon as he comes to that period of time during that day that he has to remove his khuf from that moment? The Shaykh answers by saying, The brother makes his wudu with the masah for the first time during Maghrib today. Tomorrow, he is still, just say he made his masah before Salatul Asr. He made a new wudu before Salatul Asr, and he didn't break his wudu up until Isha. He is still allowed to pray. But after that point of Maghrib, on the second day, he cannot make masah again, but he is not required to remove the khuf and make a new wudu. Meaning his wudu won't be broken automatically 24 hours after the fact. Rather, it will be broken. He will just lose the ability, this concession, to make the masah. Is that clear? Fine. The Shaykh Hafidahullah then continued by saying, by reading from the text, and a person is permitted who is in a state of travel to make masah for 3 days consecutively. 3 full days and nights. Then the Shaykh Hafidahullah gave us an authentic narration that is derived from the report of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, wherein there is the authentic narration that the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam allowed 7 days, allowed the one who is in a state of travel to make his masah up to a period of 7 days and 7 nights. And when Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu was asked about this, he said, this is the sunnah of our Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And from this hadith and from this statement of Umar, Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he was of this opinion that the masah during the state of travel is up to 7 days. And following him is the Shaykh of our Shaykh rahimahullah, Shaykh Muhammad Nasr al-Albani rahimahullah. He also followed this opinion that you are valid to make the masah up to 7 days and 7 nights if you are in a state of travel due to the authentically reported evidence. Then the Shaykh Hafidahullah continued by reading that a person is only permitted to make the masah when there is hadath asghar, when there is a minor form of breakage, a minor form of breakage of one's purity. Meaning, if a person enters into a state of janaba, he can no longer make masah. Rather, the masah is only for things that are attributed to wudu, things that can be purified through wudu. A person cannot make masah for his ghusl. Person must make a full ghusl. Therefore, the concession of masah ends when a person enters into major janaba. Into major janaba. As well, the Shaykh Hafidahullah mentions to us that when one enters into the conditions of masah, that the person must be in a state of physical tahara, in a state of physical and ritual tahara, meaning he should be in a state of wudu before putting the khuffa on. As we know, the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he used to teach his Sahaba by saying, I put them in, meaning my feet, I put them in after I was in a state of cleanliness, meaning after I was in a state of wudu. So that is also a prerequisite for the validity of putting on the khuf. Janaba as well breaks the concession and the validity of being allowed to perform al-masah. Then the Shaykh Hafidahullah read on the statement of Anas, which is deemed marfu'an, and we will study this later on today with Shaykh Salim al-Hilali, where the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the statement of Anas is elevated and raised to the level of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, meaning it's a prophetic statement. Although it is narrated through the words of Anas, that he sallallahu alaihi wasallam is known to have said, as Anas reports, that when an individual performs his wudu and then puts on his khuf, this establishes that a person must be in wudu before putting on the khuf. Then he is permitted to make masah upon the both of them and to pray in the both of them, and he does not have to remove them if he wishes, except from janaba. The statement once again from Anas, if a person makes wudu and he puts on his khuf, he is allowed to make masah upon the both of them, meaning upon both of his feet, and pray while wearing them, meaning the khuf, and he is not required to remove them if he does not wish, except when he enters in a state of janaba. That is the thing that would break the time period, the 1 day and 1 night, or the 3 days, 3 nights, or the 7 days, 7 nights. That amount of time is cut when a person enters into a state of janaba. And as is written in the book, this hadith is narrated by an Imam al-Hakim, and he deemed it authentic.
ثم قال المصنف رحمه الله: فإن كان على أعضاء وضوئه جبيرة على كسر، على أعضاء وضوئه أي على بعض أو أحد أعضاء وضوئه. جبيرة على كسر، الجبيرة هي ما يلف على البدن أو بعضه إذا كسر أو جرح أو شيء من ذلك. فإذا كان على أعضاء وضوئه جبيرة على كسر أو دواء على جرح فنقول لم يصح في السنة حديث في المسح على الجبيرة أو في المسح على الجرح إذا كان عليه دواء، بمعنى أن يكون المسح بديلا عن الغسل. ولكن ينظر إذا كان هذا العضو الذي يراد المسح عليه على وفق ما يقوله المصنف، ونحن نقول لا يمسح عليه، وإنما يعامل العضو المجبور كالعضو المبتور، يعني كأن لا عضو، وبالتالي يتوضأ وضوءا لا صلة له بهذا العضو المكسور، كأنما هو مبتور لا وجود له. أقول ينظر إذا كان الأكثر هو المجبور فإنه يتيمم، وإذا كان الأقل فإنه يعامله على ما وصفنا، يعتبره كأنه غير موجود، كأنه مبتور، وإنما يوضئ البقية من أعضائه. واضح؟ نعم. قال: وصفة مسح الخفين أن يمسح أكثر ظاهرهما، يعني لا ينظر الأطراف هكذا وجميع الجهات، وإنما الظاهر فقط بدون أي تكلف، المسح على الخفين. وأيضا بعض الناس يقول لابد من أن تمسح على اليدين معا، أو اليمين باليمين أو اليمين بالشمال. كل هذه تقييدات ما أنزل الله بها من سلطان، ولا نعرفها في الكتاب ولا في السنة، وإنما ما يتيسر لك فعله فافعله. المهم أن يكون المسح بكامل اليد على كامل ظاهر القدم، هذا هو المهم. أما أن تمسح على اليدين مع على القدمين باليدين، أو بيد واحدة بالشمال أو باليمين، كل ذلك فيه سعة إن شاء الله. قال: وأما الجبيرة فيمسح على جميعها. أقول هذا على قول من قال بجواز ذلك، وكما قلت لم يصح في السنة حديث في هذا، وإن كان قد صح أثر عن ابن عمر رضي الله عنه أنه كان إذا أصابه كسر أو وضع جبيرة أن يمسح عليها. وبالتالي ففي المسألة سعة من هذه الحيثية. من اتبع ابن عمر ومعروف فقهه وإمامته وعلمه ودرايته فله ذلك، ومن لم يتبعه من باب أن السنة أكمل وأرحب وأعظم، وأنه لا يفوت السنة شيء من مثل هذا ولو صح لنقل، لكان هذا إلى القلب أطيب، والله أعلم.
The Shaykh Hafidhahullah continued by reading from the text, and if a person finds that a limb that is supposed to be included in the wudu is injured and as such has a cast placed over it or a bandage placed over it due to a breakage or due to a medicinal reason, and if one washes over that area, he would become in a state of harm or he would be harmed, then he is permitted to wipe over the cast with water, whether in a state of major impurity or minor impurity, until he is in a state of healthiness and is cured from this ailment. The words of the Shaykh once again that are found in the book: if a person is injured or he has a breakage in one of the limbs that is required for him to wipe over, meaning an arm or a leg or something of this nature, where he is required to wipe over, to wash it with water in his wudu, but because he has a cast or he has a large bandage, or if he fears that by washing the area he will be harmed, something will affect him adversely, then it is permitted for such a person in this state to make masah, to wipe over this area, whether it due to a state of major impurity or minor impurity, to remove this impurity until he is healthy once again and is cured from this ailment. The Shaykh Hafidahullah paused in his reading and explained this issue to us by first saying, it is important to note that there is no authentically reported statement. There is no authentically reported statement from the actions of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam or from his words himself directly that a person who has a cast or who has such an injury is to wipe over it instead of washing it. Rather, what we have assessed to be the closest to the sunnah or the sunnah in this matter is that the person considers that limb is not present. It is as if that limb or that piece or that area is not present. It is as if it is detached. So if it's an arm, he will not wipe over the arm or he will not wash it. He will just skip it. He will not wipe or wash that area. He will just go on to the next thing that he is required to wash, as is the opinion of many of the scholars. So it would be valued as something that is detached, it would not be washed, and it would not be wiped over. And then the Shaykh continued by saying, if the major part of an individual are that he is with a cast on many of the parts that he is required to wash, it is sufficient for him just to perform tayammum. But if a person finds that he has the ability to wash the majority of the parts that are required by wudu or by the ghusl, then he is to perform them, and the parts that are injured, he overlooks them and does not wash them, does not wipe over them, considers them as if they are not present. Then the Shaykh Hafidahullah continued by saying, we do and wash to the extent that we have the ability to perform. Meaning the ability that you have, as far and as much as you are able to wash, that is what you are required to do. And therefore the masah is something that is not required, since we do not have the ability over this specific part. The Shaykh then continued reading by saying, and the sifah, the description of how to make masah upon the khuf, the description of how to make masah, wiping over the khuf, the two khuf, is that the individual yamsah, he wipes over the majority of the surface area of the khuf. The person is to wipe over the majority, as much as possible, of the surface area of the khuf. The Shaykh continues by saying, we once again establish that we are to wipe over as much as we have the ability. We wipe over as much as we have the ability. As for those who make the requirement that you have to wipe both of them at the same time, both feet at the same time, and things of this nature, we do not establish it as being from the sunnah, since there are no narrations to back it up. Rather we state, you may wipe with your right hand, you may wipe with your left hand, you may wipe with both hands, all of it would be deemed valid. The essence of the matter is that you wipe as much of the surface area of the khuf as you have the ability. Then the Shaykh continued by reading, as for the cast, then you are to wipe over all of them, or as much of them as possible, to fulfill this obligation. The Shaykh continues by saying, wiping over the cast, the Shaykh states in the book, wiping over the cast, you should wipe in the same way as much of the cast area as possible. The Shaykh pauses in the reading and says, although we establish there is an authentically reported statement from Abdullah ibn Umar that he would wipe over his cast, or he would wipe over the bandages, or the things that were found on his body when he was in a state of harm. This is something, for those who establish this as being their proof, it is something that is valid for them. So therefore we establish that in this issue, whether to wipe over a cast or a bandage or not, there is difference of opinion, because there are some evidences from, there is some evidence, as you have seen here, from the statements and the actions of Ibn Umar. But the one who wants what is closest to the truth, and the one who wants to follow the remnants and the traces and the narrations of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam regarding his personal actions and what he has obligated, he will realize that there are no authentic narrations of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam in this regard. And if it was something that was legislated by him, we would have seen narrations discussing it. We would have seen authentic reports from the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying, wipe over the cast, as we see authentic narrations stating wipe over the khuf and so forth. And therefore the Shaykh said, it is better to follow what is known and established from the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what is established from his sunnah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so as to establish the complete validity of the matter. No.
ثم بدأ المصنف رحمه الله بباب جديد، هو باب نواقض الوضوء، أي ما يذهب به الوضوء وينتقض. قال وهي، أي هذه النواقض، الخارج من السبيلين مطلقا، أي كل ما خرج من السبيلين، والسبيلان هما القبل والدبر. وقوله مطلقا أي ما كان كثيرا أو قليلا، كل شيء خرج من هذين الموضعين. ولكن هنالك أشياء قد لا تكون كذلك، ذكرها بعض أهل العلم. فمثلا قالوا لو أن إنسانا في بطنه دود، مرض الدود، وخرج من دبره بعض هذه الدودات نتيجة مرض معين، نسأل الله العافية، فهل ينتقض وضوءه؟ الراجح أنه لا ينتقض. ورد سؤال قبل يومين حول الرطوبة التي تجدها المرأة وتستمر في الإحساس بها، وهذه من القبل، فهل هي كذلك من نواقض الوضوء؟ فنقول الراجح أن لا، وإن هذا من الصفة التي خلق الله النساء عليها. قال والدم الكثير ونحوه، يعني ما كان غالبا، لم يكن كثيرا لكنه غالبا، أي ليس قليلا. والراجح أن ذلك ليس بناقض كما ذكرنا من قبل، وأن الدم كله طاهر، ولا دليل على من أفتى أو حكم بأن الدم الكثير ينقض الوضوء، ولكن من حيث الواقع إنسان وهو يصلي مثلا أصابه دم كثير فإنه يقطع صلاته ليغسل هذا الدم. وإننا نقول هذا لأن بعض الفقهاء قالوا الدم الكثير يقطع الوضوء أو يبطل الوضوء والصلاة. لكن لو أن هذا الدم نزف منه وهو متوضئ لكنه لا يصلي، ما هو المطلوب؟ أن يغسل الدم من باب التنظف، وأما الطهارة فلا تنتقض بذلك. قال وزوال العقل بنوم أو غيره، يعني كالإغماء مثلا أو ما يشبهه كالتخدير في العمليات الجراحية، البنج ونحوه. من نام سواء بإغماء طبيعي أو بإغماء متعمد فإن ذلك كله من أسباب نقض الوضوء. يقول النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم العين وكاء السهو، أي النوم والغفلة، فمن نام فليتوضأ. وكاء السهو أي الغطاء الذي يكون بداية للنوم، فإذا نامت العين نام الإنسان. ورسول الله عليه الصلاة والسلام له خصوصية في ذلك، قال تنام عيني ولا ينام قلبي. هذه خصوصية من خصوصيات رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. بعض الفقهاء يقول إذا كان النائم متمكنا من جلوسه فإنه لا ينتقض وضوءه، وهذا النوم غير مؤثر. أقول هذا الصحيح في حالة واحدة، إذا كان هذا النائم مربوط المجلس في مقعده، هذا حينئذ نقول فعلا يعني متمكن. أما هذا الذي ينام زاعما أنه متمكن ويتحرك شمالا ويمينا، ما أدراه أنه لا ينتقض وضوءه وهو نائم. لذلك هنالك قصة طريفة عن الإمام أبي عبيد القاسم بن سلام، له كتاب اسمه كتاب الطهور، من خير الكتب المصنفة في بابه. الإمام أبو عبيد قال كنت أقول بجواز أو بعدم نقض الوضوء للمتمكن من نومه، إلى أن حصل لي حادث رأيته أمام عيني فتركت هذا القول. قال كنت جالسا في مسجد جمعة يصلي الجمعة والخطيب يخطب، يعني ينتظر الصلاة وجالس يسمع الخطبة مع المستمعين. قال وبجانبي شيخ كبير، ونحن جالسون سمعت منه صوتا نقض فيه وضوءه، فبعد أن انتهت الخطبة وأراد أن يقوم ليصلي، قال فقلت له يا شيخ اذهب وتوضأ. قال أنا نمت متمكنا. قال والله لم تنم متمكنا، فقد سمعت نقضك للوضوء بأذني. فقال منذ ذلك الوقت تركت هذا القول وصرت أقول بأن كل نوم هو ناقض للوضوء. قال وأكل لحم الجزور أي الإبل والجمال، الرسول عليه الصلاة والسلام يقول من أكل لحم جزور فليتوضأ. وسئل عليه الصلاة والسلام أنا أتوضأ من لحوم الغنم؟ قال إن شئتم فتوضأوا. قالوا أنا أتوضأ من لحوم الإبل؟ قال نعم فتوضأوا. وبعض الناس يخلط بين مسألة أكل لحم الإبل ومسألة الوضوء مما مست النار، فيظنهما مسألة واحدة وهما مسألتان. والراجح في مسألة الوضوء مما مست النار أن آخر الأمرين كان ترك الوضوء أو ترك الوضوء مما مست النار، لكن هذا في غير لحم الإبل. لحم الإبل لو أكل سواء بمس النار أو بغيره فهو ناقض للوضوء بذاته، فلا يجوز الخلط بين هذه المسألة وتلك. قد رأيت عددا من طلبة العلم لم يتنبه للخلط بينهما. كان في بدء الأمر، أعيد المسألة هذه، كان في بدء الإسلام كل لحم مسته النار سواء كان لحم بقر أم غنم يؤمر المسلمون بالوضوء منه. إذا أكلت لحما مسته النار لابد أن تتوضأ. هذا كان في أول الإسلام، ثم بعد ذلك نسخ، فكان آخر الأمرين ترك الوضوء مما مست النار. هذا هو الحديث وهو ناسخ واضح. هذه المسألة لا علاقة لها بمسألة أكل لحم الإبل، لأن أكل لحم الإبل مسألة خاصة، فسواء مسته النار أو لم تمسه هو خارج عن المسألة الأولى. واضح؟ نعم. هنالك أيضا تنبيه آخر، وهو أن هنالك رواية فيها إيراد سبب لحديث من أكل لحم جزور فليتوضأ، لكن الرواية شديدة الضعف، ضعفها شديد جدا، وهي أن الرسول عليه الصلاة والسلام كان جالسا مع أصحابه فانتقض وضوء واحد منهم، فأرادوا أن يصلوا، وقد كانوا يأكلون ومن ضمن ما يأكلون لحم الجزور، هكذا تقول الرواية غير الصحيح، انتبهوا. فهذا الرجل الذي نقض وضوءه، هكذا تقول الرواية الباطلة، استحيا أن يتوضأ فقام ليصلي مع المصلين، فتزعم الرواية أن الرسول عليه الصلاة والسلام أراد أن يجاريه وأن لا يحرجه، فقال من أكل لحم جزور فليتوضأ. قال فقاموا كلهم فتوضأوا، وبالتالي دفع الحرج عن هذا الرجل. هذه رواية باطلة، لذلك الروايات الصحيحة تبطلها. يا رسول الله أنا أتوضأ من لحوم الغنم؟ قال إن شئتم فتوضأوا. أنا أتوضأ من لحوم الإبل؟ قال نعم فتوضأوا. أين الأكل هنا؟ أين من نقض وضوءه أو أحرج أو عذر أو لم يعذر؟ كل هذا لا وجه له. إذن لحم الإبل سواء أكل نيئا أو قد مسته النار فإنه ناقض للوضوء.
The Shaykh Hafizahullah continued by beginning with us a new chapter, which is the chapter of the nawaqid of al-wudu, the things that break or invalidate or nullify one's wudu. He begins by reading to us, وَهِيَ, of these first things, that which exits one of the two orifices, one of the two places where we cleanse ourselves from the impurities and the internal impurities such as urine or feces. Meaning the places where the place where urine exits, that is one of the orifices, and the second is where we defecate from, meaning the private parts that are known to be the private parts, the genitalia as well as the anus. These are the two things, anything that exits from them, mutlaqan. Anything, in general, on a whole, in their entirety. Anything that exits from one of these two places is something that breaks one's wudu. The Shaykh Hafidahullah paused by saying, if for example a person has a medical illness wherein he has intestinal worms, and those who are plagued with this illness, at times the worm will come out or expose itself from the anus. This is something that will not break one's wudu. As well, the issue that we were asked about, where a sister asked regarding the rutuba, the wetness that the sisters are accustomed as a natural process to feel and to have in their private. This is also something that does not invalidate the wudu, since it's an integral part, it is part of their natural makeup. So that also does not break the wudu. That excretion or that which is naturally there in the vagina, it's not something that breaks the wudu, because it is a natural, continuous occurrence. Then the Shaykh Hafidahullah continued by saying, then he continued reading, وَالْدَمْ, and blood in an excessive amount. That also, وَنَحْوِهِ, that also breaks wudu. Blood in an excessive amount. Here the Shaykh Hafidahullah paused and said, we have already established our understanding that blood is not impure. Blood is not impure, and I add, except the blood of the hayd and the menstrual blood and the blood of the postnatal bleeding or postpartum bleeding or afterbirth bleeding. That is deemed najis, as the Shaykh explained to us 2 or 3 days ago. The blood other than that exits the human body, is not najis. It's not something that is impure. So that is the first thing the Shaykh reminds you of. And therefore the Shaykh says, if a person is praying, he is standing in his prayer, and he begins to bleed excessively, he should leave the prayer and exit the prayer and go and wash the blood from himself. That is because many of the fuqaha state that bleeding in salah is something that should be abstained from. But the Shaykh says, if a person is sitting in a state of wudu, as we are sitting now, a person is sitting in the state of wudu, and he begins to bleed, all he must do is wash the blood. He does not need to make a new wudu. Do you see the difference? He does not need to, all he must do, a person who is outside salah, all that this person must do is wash the blood from himself, and he does not need to make a new wudu so as to be ready for prayer, if he was already in a state of wudu. So bleeding itself does not break the purity or the wudu of an individual. Then the Shaykh Hafidahullah continued by saying, by reading to us, and if a person loses his mental faculty, his control over his mental capabilities, as a result of sleep or a loss or that which is similar to it, and the Shaykh adds, if a person goes into an operation and they give him anesthetics, or meaning it's a drug-induced sleep, or a person loses his mental capabilities for whatever reason, drugs or other, or falls asleep, then his wudu breaks. And the Shaykh reminds us that the Rasul ﷺ said that the eyes are the door or are the entrance into sleep, meaning once the eyes begin to feel heavy and they are shut and a person begins to sway, that person has become and entered into sleep. And we see this also from the statement of the Rasul ﷺ where he says, and this was a speciality, a thing that given only to the Messenger ﷺ, that his eyes would be sleeping, his eyes were closed, but his heart was awake. So it establishes that the eyes, when a person is sleeping, one of the signs or one of the attributes of sleep is that the eyes are shut. The Shaykh then continued in his explanation of this issue in a little bit more detail by saying, there are those who differentiate between falling asleep while sitting up and those who are falling asleep while lying down. The Shaykh mentioned that if a person is sitting up, regardless if he's sitting up or lying down, if a person, and you will see them, he will be sitting up and his eyes are closed. If he sways and he nods off, that is a person, if he cannot control his body movement in this manner, how can he expect to control how can he expect to recognize if he has broken his wudu or not? So therefore, it doesn't matter if the person is sleeping while sitting or if he's sleeping while lying down. Sleep is considered sleep. And then the Shaykh narrates to us the story of one of the Imams as he was sitting in one of the masajid during a Jumu'ah masjid, meaning a masjid that was dedicated for the large crowds of the Jumu'ah prayer. As the Khatib was giving a khutbah, this Imam says, a person, an older gentleman sitting next to me, a Shaykh, an old man sitting next to me, he began to doze off and nod off while sitting upright. And while he was in this position, I heard him flatulate. I heard him break wind. So when it came time, when the Iqamah was made and we were going to start the prayer, I told this old gentleman, this Shaykh, I told him, you were sleeping, you should go and make wudu. The older gentleman told him, I was sleeping while sitting upright. This Imam, he tells us that from that day forward, he changed his opinion from thinking that it is valid to sleep while sitting up and you do not need to make your wudu, from this incident that occurred in front of him. Because the person, he thought retained his wudu and would have continued in his prayer even after he was heard to have broken the prayer. The Imam tells this person, I have heard you, by Allah, I have heard you break your wudu. So therefore, it is something that is regardless, irrelevant, whether you are sleeping while sitting up or whether you are sleeping while lying down and so forth. Then the Shaykh continued by reading to us, and eating camel meat also breaks wudu. The consumption of camel meat is something that will also break one's wudu. And this is known from the authentic hadith of the Rasul ﷺ, where he was asked by one of the Sahaba, if we eat lamb or goat or something, or a type of cattle or sheep or something of this nature, are we required to make wudu? The Rasul ﷺ said, if you wish. Then they asked him, Ya Rasulullah, if one of us eats camel meat, is he required to make wudu? He said yes. Meaning the Rasul ﷺ made a distinction. The Shaykh then gives us an important issue, which I asked him to repeat because I didn't catch the information the first time. During the early part of Islam, the Rasul ﷺ had made it an injunction upon the Muslim Ummah, as Allah had revealed to him, any meat that was cooked, any cooked meat that was cooked on fire, was something that you were required to make wudu from. Any meat that was cooked by fire, you were required to make wudu after consuming it. But this statement was abrogated. This statement was abrogated by the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam later on. Some people became confused, thinking that camel meat, if it is cooked, then it is something that would be you are required to make wudu from. And if it is not cooked on fire, then you do not have to make wudu. These are two separate issues. These are two separate issues. Because we see that Rasul ﷺ mentioned specifically that camel meat is something you must make wudu from. The Shaykh then continued by narrating to us an extremely authentic hadith. And he narrates it to you so that you know what people have said. The hadith it is da'if jiddan. It's a very weak hadith that people have reported in this chapter regarding the consumption of camel meat. They narrate, and this is a very weak hadith, it's not an authentic hadith, that one day the Rasul ﷺ and his Sahaba were gathered, as they claim, and they were eating camel meat. They were having a feast and they were eating camel meat. And one of the Sahaba, as they allege, broke his wudu. When they stood up to pray, that Sahabi, as they claim, became embarrassed to go and make wudu so that people will know who it was that broke wind. So the Rasul ﷺ knew that that person was going to pray in a state of no wudu. So the Rasul ﷺ, being merciful, he said, anyone who's eaten camel meat, meaning everyone there, let him go and make wudu. So that was to save that Sahabi embarrassment, so that they can all make wudu, and therefore the Sahabi wouldn't become exposed as to who it was that passed wind. This is a very unauthentic hadith. The Shaykh is just using it to mention it to you so that you recognize what these people have claimed and stated. So what we establish as being the truth is the authentic hadith of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When they asked him, Ya Rasulullah, if we eat from the lahm of sheep or goats and things like this, do we have to make wudu? He says, if you so wish, meaning it is not required. Then he was asked sallallahu alayhi wa sallam about camel meat, and he said, yes, meaning you are required to make your wudu.
قال ومس المرأة بشهوة. وتحت هذه المسألة مسألتان. المسألة الأولى حكم مس المرأة إذا كانت أجنبية، فهذا لا يجوز. ولكن لو حصل أن أحدا من الناس مس امرأة أجنبية فهل ينتقض وضوءه؟ الراجح أنه لا ينتقض وضوءه أولا، ولكنه آثم بفعله ثانيا. وبالتالي فإن مس المرأة التي هو محرم عليها وهي محرمة عليه كزوجة أو كأم أو أخت أو بنت، فضلا عن زوجته التي هو حلالها وهي حلاله، فإن ذلك كله المس منه لا ينقض الوضوء مطلقا. ولكن عندنا شيء، لو أن أحدا مس امرأته أو امرأة أخرى، كما قلنا بالنسبة لمس المرأة الأخرى بأنه لا يجوز، ولكن إن حصل فإنه لا ينقض وضوء. لكن هنالك صورة قد ينتقض بها الوضوء لا للمس ولكن لأثره. لو أن أحدا مس امرأته أو امرأة أخرى ثم حصل منه شهوة أنتجت إمزاء، فهذا ينتقض وضوءه بالمذي لا بمجرد المس. قال ومس الفرج. مس الفرج، الرسول عليه الصلاة والسلام يقول من مس ذكره فليتوضأ. وفي حديث آخر سئل الرسول عليه الصلاة والسلام عمن مس ذكره فقال إن هو إلا بضعة منك، أي جزء من بدنك، كما ورد عن بعض التابعين قال لا أبالي أمسست ذكري أم أنفي، على اعتبار أن هذا مس غير شهوة. إذن القول الفصل في هذه المسألة أن المس من غير شهوة لا ينقض الوضوء، وأما إذا كان المس بشهوة فينقض الوضوء. إذن هذا التفصيل متعلق بمسألة مس الذكر وليس متعلقا بمسألة مس المرأة، فلا ينبغي الخلط بين هذا وذاك. ومن هذا الفرع ما يسأله كثير من الناس، يقول ونحن أحيانا بعد الاغتسال ونحن نلبس ثيابنا قد تمس أيدينا الفرج، فهل هذا ينقض؟ نقول لا ينقض، لأن هذا مس طبيعي، مس معتاد، وليس مسا بشهوة، ليس مسا مقصودا يراد به الشهوة. نعم. قال وتغسيل الميت. وأما تغسيل الميت فهو ليس من النواقض، وإنما يستحب لمن غسل الميت أن يغتسل، كما قال ابن عباس رضي الله عنه كنا نغسل موتانا ونحملهم، فمنا من يغتسل ومنا من لا يغتسل، منا من يتوضأ ومنا من لا يتوضأ. إذن هذا من المستحبات وليس من الواجبات. وعليه يحمل قول النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام: من غسل ميتا فليغتسل ومن حمله فليتوضأ، على سبيل الاستحباب لا الإيجاب. قال: والردة، الردة الخروج من الدين، والخروج من الدين قد يكون باعتقاد أو قول أو عمل. وقد كذب علينا وافترى من قال بأننا لا نكفر إلا بالاعتقاد، أو أقول قد جهل علينا وأخطأ علينا من زعم هذا الزعم، فهو إما جاهل وإما كاذب. وكما أن الإيمان قول وعمل واعتقاد، فكذلك عكسه وهو الكفر قول وعمل واعتقاد. هذا هو الأصل في الحكم على الأفعال والأعمال والأقوال الظاهرة والباطنة. ولكن تنزيل هذه الأحكام على الأعيان لا بد له من شروط معتبرة عند أهل العلم. ولا يكون الحاكم بالتكفير أي إنسان، بل خاصة أهل العلم وطلاب العلم. أما جعل كلمات التكفير على الألسن، على لسان الصغير والكبير والجاهل والعامي، هكذا يتبجحون بها ويملؤون أفواههم فيها، فليس وراء ذلك إلا الجهل والعياذ بالله. فالردة محبطة للأعمال كلها، لئن أشركت ليحبطن عملك. ولا شك أن من الأعمال الطهارة، فتنتقض الطهارة وتبطل وتحبط كما تنتقض أعمال المرتد كلها عياذا بالله. قال لقوله تعالى، أي في ذكر نواقض الوضوء: أو جاء أحد منكم من الغائط أو لامستم النساء. قوله أو جاء أحد منكم من الغائط إشارة إلى الحدث الأصغر بأنواعه، أو لامستم النساء إشارة إلى الحدث الأكبر بأنواعه. قال: وسئل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم: أنا أتوضأ من لحوم الإبل؟ فقال: نعم، رواه مسلم. وقال في الخفين: ولكن من غائط وبول ونوم، رواه النسائي والترمذي وصححه. أي من نواقض المسح على الخفين، وبالتالي هي من نواقض الوضوء مباشرة الغائط والبول والنوم. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين، وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.
هل يجوز المسح بعد الغسل؟ يعني هل الغسل والوضوء معا يترتب عليه المسح من بعد الغسل؟ نعم. الشيخ سليم هيأتي على الساعة 9 تماما، هو قد تأخر إن شاء الله.
The Shaykh Hafidahullah continued in his final discussion with us regarding the nawaqid of wudu, that which invalidates one's wudu, by saying, coming in contact with a woman bishahwa, due to lustful intentions, breaks one's wudu. Here the Shaykh Hafidahullah said that there are two important issues to discuss.
بالنسبة للوضوء من الشهوة، المذي هو الذي بيقطع الوضوء. المذي هو هذا الذي نعم، لكن إن لم ينزل المذي لا شيء. مع التنبيه كان امرأة
The Shaykh Hafidahullah, as we began, mentioned, reading to us from the text, coming in contact with a woman with lustful intentions breaks wudu. The Shaykh Hafidahullah said the hukm is on two separate issues. The first is the woman who is strange strange from the man, meaning she is a non-mahram. She is a woman who he is not allowed to come in contact with, whom he is not a mahram for. Ajnabiyya. This type of woman, it is sinful for him to come in contact with her regardless of the wudu issue. It is sinful for him to come in contact with her regardless of the wudu. And this is an important issue to understand. So therefore, the Shaykh says we are not allowed to come in contact, in physical contact, where our body and the body of a woman who is a non-mahram come together and touch in any shape, way or form, intentionally. Then the Shaykh Hafidahullah continued by saying, this is a practice that is not allowed and it is a sinful practice, but it would not break the wudu just by coming in contact. Just by the physical touch, that would not invalidate or break one's wudu. The Shaykh will come later to explain this further. His wudu will be broken by breaking his faith and belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Shaykh paused and explained, apostasy can be out of internal belief, out of statements, and it can also be as a result of actions. And the Shaykh says, the ones who have lied about us, and who have oppressed us unjustly, and who have claimed about us, whether out of ignorance or out of intention, that we only make takfir only on a person who has disbelieved as a result of i'tiqad, they have oppressed us and have lied about us in this regard, and we are free from it. The Shaykh says, we all know and we all understand that disbelief, turning away from Islam, and apostasy can be either by the belief that a person